The mysteries of ancient Egypt have always captured my imagination. Great works of stone on a massive scale, alone among the shifting sands of the Sahara, hinting at secrets of a culture that has been lost for centuries. Today, I'm going to try to capture some of that majesty and mystery in miniature by building an Egyptian tomb in a sandstone cliff. I started the project by collecting inspiration, watching countless documentaries, YouTube videos, and taking in images online of my favorite Egyptian sites. I've always been particularly drawn to Abu Simbel, the great temple made by the pharaoh Ramses II in Aswan, Egypt. Embedded in the sandstone cliff, 4 statues of Ramses sit and stare out into the desert, sending a clear message of the pharaoh's power to the Nubians to the south. I also always loved the mortuary temples and tombs in the valleys of the kings, the final resting places of the pharaohs embedded deep into the rock of the hillsides. Now, Abu Simbel is not a tomb, but I started sketching out the design of my tomb with a large inspiration from that imposing facade. There's something permanent and enticing about a structure carved out of the cliff around it. So here's the crazy thing about Egyptian sculptures and stonework. Egypt didn't have iron smelting technology until the 6th century BC. The only iron they had before that was very rare blades made out of meteoric iron fallen from the sky. Abu Simbel was made in the 13th century BC, during the 19th dynasty, some 700 years before that. So to sculpt these massive works, laborers would pound out the rough shape with hard diorite pounding stones, and then sculptors would refine their work with copper chisels. Copper is a soft metal that would have constantly lost its point and had to be reforged. This just hammers home, no pun intended, how each of these ancient works is a massive undertaking that would take years of dedicated human labor and skilled craftsmanship. Now, if you or I want to make something like this, and aren't classically trained in the artistic conventions of the 19th dynasty, or if you want to forego the painstakingly difficult process of carving a statue with soft copper chisels, well, the good news is that Anycubic has you covered. With 3D printing, you can create sculptures much the way an ancient pharaoh would have. You just choose the design, tell it to go, and it basically happens while you sleep. All you have to do is come back when it's done and inspect it. I'm using the Anycubic Vyper, which is Anycubic's newest SLA filament printer, and I have to say, I really like this thing. If you're interested in getting one for yourself, I'll put a link in the description. All of the designs that I used for this project were found on Thingiverse, which has a huge library of free cool sculptures and things to print. I printed 2 large sculptures of a seated pharaoh that will flank the doors. So with my sculptures handled, I go to work building the facade that will be the entrance to my tomb. I used some XPS insulation foam for this, skipping years of hard labor in the baking sun by using my Proxxon cutter to get some nice crisp lines. I wanted the sculpture above the door to be embedded in the facade to really sell the carved in situ impression that I wanted. I chose this design of the pharaoh flanked by 2 Egyptian gods. On the left, the falcon-headed Horus, and on the right, Set, his one-time rival. In Egyptian mythology, Horus and Set had a bitter conflict, but eventually were reconciled after Set's defeat. Set had taken Horus's eye, but it was returned, thus restoring balance, or mat, which is an important concept in ancient Egypt. Thus, my symbolic interpretation of placing the statue here is to send a clear message that the pharaoh is crucial to the maintaining of order and balance. Even Horus and Set can see that. Now, I'm not a scholar of Egyptology, so this could be total nonsense, but it kind of makes sense, and more importantly, I like the look of the sculpture here, so we're going with it. Now, with the facade blocked in, it's time to make the massive sandstone cliff in which the tomb will be embedded. To make the rough shape, I used some 2-inch insulation foam held together with Gorilla Glue construction adhesive. I carved the rough shape of the cliffs with a handheld hot wire cutter, which cuts smoothly between the layers of foam, hiding the gaps somewhat. I make 2 large cliffs that curve away to either side to form a flat back and a removable top piece. On one of the cliff pieces, I carved a switch-backing path into the stones, because I thought that'd be cool. Next up is to texture the stones. As far as I know, I came up with this method, and I'm really proud of it. First, you cut a whole bunch of horizontal lines with a sharp hobby knife. These will represent the layers of sediment that the sandstone is comprised of. Next, I roughly run the retracted case of the craft knife perpendicular to the lines cut in the previous step, chipping off chunks of foam in a random pattern. This simulates how a sandstone cliff weathers unevenly, exposing these ancient layers. If you're doing it right, you're going to end up with a massive amount of off-cut foam shavings. Get those out of the way, because there's more. Next, I'm going to take a wire bristle brush and scrub along the existing layers to add even more laminar texture and fine detail. The problem with the wire brush is it can leave some fluffy bits that don't look realistic. Using a heat gun, I melt these away, applying careful heat. Too much heat will melt the foam, but the right amount will create a sealed and detailed surface. With this done, I use the wire brush again, and then one more round of heat gun to get the final texture. Nice. To add a bit of loose rock and debris, I start with some Aleene's tacky glue, then apply a few pieces of foam for large rocks, and then some small rocks, sand, and finally some grout. Next up, it's ready to paint. I decided to paint these massive chunks of exposed foam with only spray paint because I like to live on the edge. The propellants in most spray paints will dissolve this kind of foam if you spray too closely, so I kept my distance with the cans. I used a medium chocolate brown for the deepest shadows, sand for the mid-tone, and then sprayed directly above with ivory. This method allows you to closely mimic the direction of the sun with very little effort, so the raised edges of the piece have the brightest highlights, just like if it was in direct desert sunlight. I wanted the facade to be engraved with hieroglyphics, but I wasn't really sure what it should say. It's kind of moot, I guess, since I don't really know how to read hieroglyphics, but since I needed to start somewhere, I looked up some funerary inscriptions to base my own inscriptions on, came up with a few suitable messages for the facade, ran them through the translator, and started drawing them directly on the foam with a Micron pen. The ink in these pens melts the foam very subtly after a few passes, leaving a recessed impression. I decided this would be the tomb of the fictional pharaoh Erichobotep. Now, whenever a royal name is written in hieroglyphs, it's surrounded with this pill-shaped outline called a cartouche. If you're like me and can't read any hieroglyphs, maybe you can now at least spot the royal names when you look at some Egyptian text. Interestingly enough, this is how the Rosetta Stone was translated. The meaning of hieroglyphs was actually lost from the Roman period up until the early 1800s, when a French officer in Napoleon's army noticed the Rosetta Stone in use as part of a wall of a fortress in Egypt. The Rosetta Stone was special because it had the same royal decree engraved in it 3 times in 3 different languages: Greek, Demotic, and then hieroglyphs. Scholars were able to use their knowledge of Greek and the idea that foreign names might be spelled phonetically, and then they were able to translate the cartouches of Cleopatra and Alexander and eventually translate the whole language. Anyways, I used Erichobotep's cartouche several times throughout the inscription, but of course I had to include the cartouche of my lovely wife on the doorway as well, the Queen Hatshepsut. I think it turned out pretty awesome. The next step was to paint the facade. I was nervous a little bit about spray paint melting all my fiddly carving work, so I painted a layer of craft paints on first. When that was done, I sprayed it the same colors as the other elements, and to add some more contrast back to the hieroglyphs, I did an oil wash with burnt umber oil paint and some mineral spirits. I made a bit of a mess of it too. This is why I like to craft things that are supposed to be thousands of years old. You can blame any weird mistakes and sloppiness on the ravages of time. Alright, the piece is all put together, it's looking pretty wicked. Ready for some daring tomb robbers to risk their skins in search of the treasure inside. I kept the pieces separate so you can make a canyon or standalone hills as well. I also left space inside for the tomb proper. I'll be building the interior in a future video, complete with lavish funerary goods and a spectacular hoard of treasure, representing everything that Erichobotep will need to live in royal splendor in the afterlife. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. I want to thank my patrons for their continued support. It really means the world to me. If you'd like to be the newest member of my Patreon crew, there'll be a link down in the description below. Your support is what allows me to make these videos, and I can't thank you all enough. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.